to the share screen. And yeah, so the plan today is to finish the respiratory lecture, review for the exam. You guys should have gotten on Canvas. I sent out the study guide for the next exam. Then on Monday, we'll have the lecture exam. This will be at 8 a.m. as usual, and you'll have some time to do it. Instead of the usual time, you'll have 45 minutes, and instead of more than one opportunity to answer, you will have one chance to answer. So I'm sort of upping it a little bit because you guys seem to be rising to the challenge. And let me go ahead and get this. We've already started. So, all right. So let's go back to the respiratory. And before I get started, does anyone have any questions at anything? All right, hold on one second here. Sorry about this. Okay, I guess no questions. If you do, you can always contact me via email and or we can request to do a Zoom meeting. All right. So where we left off last time with the respiratory system, we had just gotten through, just to kind of back up, we spoke about functions, the anatomical structures that comprise the respiratory system, beginning with the nose and all the way down to the alveoli. We did break up or divide up the structures into two main functional capacities, where we have the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. And we spoke about structural characteristics of each. Remember, with the conducting zone, the function is to condition air, moisten, clean it, and essentially prepare it for the respiratory zone, where we'll have gas exchange. We did speak about some of the structural changes between the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, all the way down to the alveoli. What are the changes that occur? Changes in the epithelium, changes in the cartilage, so on. Oops. We then got to the final frontier, the alveoli. We spoke about, again, this is along with the respiratory bronchioles, are the site for gas exchange. I mentioned the alveoli. The characteristics are we have a thin epithelium. I know it's kind of small, but you've seen these slides before. Thin epithelium, which allows for rapid diffusion of oxygen and CO2 in the other direction. We spoke to the fact that there are three cells, the type 1 cells, the type 2 cells. Remember the surfactant producing. Understand the role of surfactant, why it's important. Remember, it prevents the lungs from collapsing and allows them to reinflate due to the breaking of hydrogen bonds, because it is a detergent-like molecule. And then the third cell, which are the alveolar macrophages, much like the macrophages that we see in the brain, the microglia. And later we'll take a look at a next topic, the cells of the digestive tract, that there are macrophages in the liver. We have what's called the respiratory membrane, which is essentially the point of the junction between the alveoli and the capillaries, what the oxygen needs to travel across to get to the blood from the alveoli. I remember there's three layers: the capillary endothelium, which is the tunica intima, the type 1 alveolar cells, which is what we just mentioned, and in between that we have a glue type of material called the basal lamina, which holds it all together. All right, so today we're going to jump right into the lungs. And of course, when you think about the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli, they're all permeating through the lungs, right? The lungs are these big sacs which contain all these tubes and air spaces. So where are the lungs located? They're located, of course, in the thoracic cavity, which, if you remember from way back when, the thoracic cavity is separated from the lower abdominal pelvic cavity by this important muscle called the diaphragm, which we'll learn a bit more about today. The lungs are surrounded by a membrane. Here we have another appearance of the serous membranes. These are called pleura or pleural membranes. The innermost, again, following the usual formula that we spoke about, these are the visceral pleura, surrounded by this cavity called the pleural cavity. And then the outer membrane is known as the parietal pleura. So again, that's the same formula like we see with the pericardium. And we'll see it later with the digestive tract. All right, so each pleural, so what can we say about the pleural cavity? Each pleural cavity is lined by the pleural membrane, as I mentioned. What is the function of the pleural cavity? Well, pleural cavity is, even though I called it a space, it is a fluid-filled space that helps to lubricate the linings, the actual visceral and parietal pleura itself, which reduces friction. Because one of the things that happens during breathing, much like happens every time the heart beats, is there's movement. When the heart moves, of course, that can cause friction. When the lungs move, that can cause friction. So this lubricating fluid helps to prevent that. What's kind of fascinating about this, these pleural membranes are also kind of a protective in the sense that, say, if one lung is collapsed due to what's called a pneumothorax condition, due to this airtight condition with these membranes, the other lung will remain the same, will remain functional. All right, let me just check something here. Okay. All right, so a little bit of the anatomy of the lungs, and I'll show you some diagrams of this. The superior tip of the lung, so that would be the upper portion, is the apex. The base, or the bottom part, which is actually close proximity to the diaphragm, is called the base, concave inferior surface. There's a region known as the hilum. I'll show you some pictures of this. This is an indented area, and this is the enter and exit point for blood vessels, bronchial tubes, as well as nerves that go to and from the lung. And those structures that I mentioned, the blood vessels, the bronchi, bronchioles, and nerves, are sometimes called the root as they enter and exit the lungs. All right, blood supply. Well, you should be pretty well have a very good understanding of the blood supply already when we were talking about the circulatory system. We have the pulmonary arteries. Again, this is part of the pulmonary circuit. We have blood vessels that go between the heart and the lungs. The blood vessels that carry oxygen-poor blood from the heart to the lungs are known as pulmonary arteries. Remember, they're bringing blood from the right side, which is carrying oxygen-poor blood. These are the blue. And then we've got the vessels that are carrying oxygen-rich blood, which they become oxygenated from the gas exchange as air goes into the alveoli. And this oxygen then is carried via hemoglobin, right, back to the heart, where it's then pumped out from the left side through the aorta, where we can oxygenate all the organs of the body. The nerve supply of the lungs, the nerves are under the influence of the autonomic nervous system, primarily. We'll focus on that. The autonomic nervous system includes, of course, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And hopefully you guys remember, of course, remember the sympathetic is the fight or flight. Remember, this is the mobilization branch, preparing us to deal with a stressful situation, whether it's a real situation or it's just perceived. No matter what, we react by needing to bring in more oxygen, right? And of course, the heart rate kicks up to help move all that oxygen to the appropriate tissues, such as the skeletal muscle. Parasympathetic, of course, is the rest and digest. So accordingly, the parasympathetic, by causing a reducing the amount of air going through the lungs, since you don't need it, triggers what we call a bronchoconstriction. And remember, of course, vasodilation, we talk about blood vessels, that helps to keep the blood pressure low, right? So decrease blood pressure, decrease airflow. And you might wonder, how can you have dilation causing a decrease in airflow and a constriction causing a decrease? Well, of course, these are two separate tubes. When you constrict the airflow, that reduces the amount of air. When you increase the volume of blood, it puts less pressure. It doesn't have to go through that small little vessel. And so it lowers the blood pressure. Sympathetic, bronchodilation and vasoconstriction, again, raising blood pressure, increasing airflow. Again, a good clinical example of this is the drug called albuterol, which is a drug that mimics the effects of norepinephrine and causes the bronchioles to dilate for those people who have asthma, since they're going through a bronchospasm. All right, so more at the superficial, not any less important feature of the lungs, the outer surface. We have the right lung and the left lung. But as you can see, you might be able to tell that they're not bilaterally symmetrical. The right lung contains 3 lobes, what we call here we go. The superior lobe, what am I looking at? I'm sorry. Yeah, the superior, did I do this? Right, 1, 2, 3, yes. I'm sorry. The right lung contains 3 lobes: superior, middle, and inferior lobes. 1, 2, 3. Each of these lobes are divided by a fissure. The separation or the division between the superior and the middle lobe is called the horizontal fissure, which kind of makes sense. The division between the middle and the inferior lobes is called the oblique fissure, for obvious reasons. So there we have 3. On the left side, we have 2 lobes. We have this very large superior lobe, and we have a smaller inferior lobe, and they're, of course, divided by also another oblique fissure. One thing I wanted to mention, this should probably be listed down below. One of the reasons, the main reason why these 2 lobes aren't exactly the same is because, as you know, on the left side, we have the heart. This is the space for the heart. And the heart kind of pushes in on the left, which has resulted in the creation of this little, what's called the cardiac notch, which is a nice little pocket for the heart to fit in on the left side. So this is the hilum that I was talking about before. Here you can see we've got in red, these are the pulmonary veins. In blue, we've got the pulmonary arteries, right? Actually, here are the arteries. Here's the arteries and veins. Up here, we have the bronchi. Okay, so you can kind of see the makeup. So remember, this area is the hilum, but these structures, of course, these 3 structures, the arteries, the veins, and the bronchi are all part of what we call the root. And if we are in our actual anatomy lab, I would show you a human lung, a real human lung where you can actually see all these different structures. Okay, so we've spoken enough about the structures to give you hopefully a good understanding of what's going on in each region and how there's structural features of them that allow for these different events to occur, whether we're looking at conducting, respiratory zone, whatever. Now let's take a look to see how we breathe. And of course, day in and day out, we really take it for granted that we don't have to think about breathing. It's going to happen whether we think about it or not. Having said that, we still need to, or we can modify our breathing. Things that happen like stress, if we're in pain, other factors that can influence breathing. But what we're going to take a look at today is typically kind of just the basic rhythm of breathing. There's 4 factors that come into play. First, we have that are important, that dictate breathing. The first one refers to what we call pressure volume changes. And we'll talk about how volume changes in the lung change the internal pressure, which influence our ability to breathe. We'll take a look at structures from other areas, and I'll just mention here primarily the brain, which contains structures and nerves that ultimately innervate the respiratory muscles to influence the contraction. We'll talk about chemoreceptors, which are these specialized groups of cells that are sensitive to changes in oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH. And then, of course, ultimately, we'll take a look at contraction of muscle. And again, in not any particular order. All right, so first let's take a look at the pressure-volume relationship that dictates breathing. You notice here we have 3 distinct phases. Example, we have 1, 2, 3. Phase 1 is the at-rest period. Phase 2 is what it looks like when we're inhaling. Phase 3 is what happens when we're exhaling. All right. Second thing I want to mention is if you take a look at the pressures. Now, when I talk about pressure, that's kind of how our body works. Blood flows from high pressure to low pressure. Air flows from high pressure to low pressure. Just like water in a hose. It goes from a high pressure site to a low pressure. That's kind of what governs it. So for oxygen to come into the body during breathing, there has to be a pressure change that's going to allow it to occur. First, let's take a look at just when we're not, kind of in between breaths, at rest. When we're at rest, we're going to take a look at 2 distinct regions of pressure. First of all, the outside pressure, or the atmospheric pressure. The atmospheric pressure is roughly about 760 millimeters of mercury. Those of you guys that have studied the weather or just seen the news or other things, that's just what we call 1 atmosphere. That's the pressure outside, that's surrounding us. There's also a pressure inside the lungs, and this is called the alveolar pressure. At rest, the outside pressure, 760, equals the inside pressure, 760. When we have this situation, there's no net movement of air. Like I said, it's in between breaths, we're at rest. During inhalation, or what I should more correctly say is prior to the onset of inhalation, there's a change in pressure. As you can see, the outside pressure doesn't change, right? That's kind of out of our control. That's just the atmospheric pressure. But our alveolar pressure is now 758. If you look closely at this diagram, take a look at the lungs themselves, the size of the lungs. But take a look at them at rest, take a look at them during phase 2, and you notice they're bigger, right? There's a volume increase. The increase in lung volume is responsible for a decrease in pressure. There's a law, and let me refer to it for a second. Let's see. And you may have heard this, and you've heard this in physiology or other classes. It's called Boyle's law. Boyle's law, which basically, just to simplify the law somewhat, basically says that pressure is inversely related to volume, 1 over V. It's a much more complex equation. There's there's more terms, but the real summary of it, pressure is inversely related to volume. All right. So increase in volume decreases the pressure. And now we have a pressure gradient, high outside, low inside. This is going to draw air in. We're inhaling now. Take a look. Of course, we know the next step that comes after inhaling is exhaling. Look what happens here. The pressure outside, of course, that's not going to change, but the pressure inside the lungs is 762. It's higher. Why? The volume is decreased. This is the resting size. This is the size that increases prior to inhaling. This is the size that it decreases to prior to exhaling. When you decrease the volume, you increase the pressure, which is going to push air out. So those are the pressure changes that are occurring. Now, every time we answer a question, it creates another question. Why is the volume changing to begin with? The volume is changing because of the actions of a couple groups of muscles. Here we're only taking a look at one, the diaphragm, but the reality is, especially during quiet breathing, there's another muscle called the external intercostal, which you guys know about that muscle. And both of those muscles in quiet breathing, when they contract, this increases the volume of the lungs and the thoracic cavity. As you can see, here's the diaphragm in its resting stage. When the diaphragm contracts, it flattens, which increases the volume. When the external intercostals, though you can't see them here, when they contract, it lifts the roof of the thoracic cavity, increasing the volume there, thereby decreasing the pressure. All right, so we've answered some questions. Why do we inhale and exhale? Changes in pressure, which is dictated by a change in volume of the thoracic cavity. Why is there a change in volume? Due to muscle contraction. So we'll kind of build on that. All right. So where does it all begin? As far as, we know that the diaphragm and the external intercostals are skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles are neurogenic, right? So they depend on nerve input, unlike cardiac muscle, right? Which is influenced by autonomic nerves, but it doesn't require them because we have the conducting, the electrical conduction system. In the brain, there is the respiratory center, which generates the basic rhythm of breathing, and the area that we're looking at is the medulla oblongata. This is where the basic rhythm of breathing is generated. We have nerves in there that do many different things. Other, we're involved in cardiac function, other functions, but there's a subset of nerves that are crucial to generate action potentials or electrical impulses that ultimately will lead to muscle contraction, diaphragm and external intercostals. From the medulla, nerves leave the diaphragm, and they're known as inspiratory neurons. So the medulla oblongata, the nerves in there spontaneously generate action potentials, electrical impulses, which are conveyed to nerves called inspiratory neurons, which ultimately will lead to the muscles. Well, we'll take a look at some of those nerves in a second. You've heard of them before. That'll be the phrenic and the intercostal nerves, but we'll take a look at them later. if the medulla oblongata is really the center for breathing, it's the center of the universe, it's what generates the basic rhythm of breathing. We have other areas, two other structures. One is the pons, as you can see right here. The pons I like to think of is an area that fine tunes the medulla. Whereas the medulla generates the breathing, the pons can influence how fast or how slow, how deep or how shallow. We also have another area of the body, special structures, that also influence breathing rhythm. And these are what are known as chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors, as the name implies, these are structures that are receptive to chemical changes. They're sensitive. They're found primarily in two areas of the body. They're found, first of all, in the systemic circulation in the aorta, or I should say on the aorta, and on the carotid artery, which is a branch of the aorta. You can see these little clusters. These are specialized groups of cells that basically are sensitive to changes in carbon dioxide, oxygen, and ultimately pH, because the levels of carbon dioxide, due to the conversion to carbonic acid, influences the pH. We want the pH to be roughly 7.4. If it gets too low or too high due to CO2 levels, our body needs to respond accordingly to stabilize it. So how do these receptors down here, that's fine that they're sensitive to those gases, but this is where the breathing is generated, right? Well, we have these nerves, as you can see right here. We have the vagus nerve, which picks up signals from what we call the aortic bodies. So these chemoreceptors are called bodies: aortic bodies on the aorta, carotid bodies on the carotid artery. Once these cells sense changes, or they sense levels of oxygen, CO2, or pH, they report back to the brain via two distinct nerves. The aortic bodies report back by way of the vagus nerve. You've heard of that nerve many times, right? That's the 10th cranial nerve. It does a lot of different things: digestion, respiratory, cardiac functions, reports back to the medulla. What about the carotid bodies? They report back to the brain via another nerve, another cranial nerve. That would be the glossopharyngeal. So those are two what we call peripheral chemoreceptors. We also have chemoreceptors located right within the medulla at a site distinct from where the breathing center is, and these are just called central chemoreceptors. So we've got a pretty good way to keep track of the conditions in the blood and the body. All right. Okay, so let's get to the nuts and bolts. Some terms to mention to you. The whole process of inhaling and exhaling is what we call pulmonary ventilation. And of course, we alternate between inhaling and exhaling, which you can also call inspiring or expiring. Same name, you've probably seen those two interchangeably. Another example of words in anatomy that have a second word that means the same thing. All right. So let's kind of connect the dots a bit. All right. So we've got the medulla, which is generating the basic rhythm of breathing. Right. And how is it doing it? By sending electrical signals by way of nerves that are going to innervate, at least in what we call quiet breathing. So we're going to focus on two different types of breathing. Quiet breathing, kind of like you're doing right now, probably, or what we call deep breathing. With quiet breathing, we have two main sets of muscles. The diaphragm, which you can barely see under the ribs right there. It's kind of a dome-shaped muscle, so it kind of goes like this. And when it's resting and when it's contracting, it's flattened. And then the second group of muscles are the external intercostals. When these muscles are innervated by the nerves, they contract. And in the case of the diaphragm, they flatten, which increases some way to look at it with this going on, we're basically lowering the floor and raising the roof with the external intercostals. So when the external intercostals contract, we lift the roof. When the diaphragm contracts, we drop the floor. We're thereby increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity. That's inhaling. Now to exhale, basically it's just a passive recoil. Just to elasticity, what happens, the muscles relax, but they go a little bit further to make that volume even smaller than it was before. And this leads to an increase in pressure, remember, due to a volume decrease, which is going to force air out. All right. As I mentioned, there's two sets of nerves. There's the intercostal nerves, which are responsible for innervating the external intercostal muscles. What you see in yellow are the nerves. These ones up here. And then we have the phrenic nerve, which you remember is part of the cervical plexus. This nerve that comes down, you can see it right here. It comes down, actually goes over the heart. And as you can see, it's spreading out and innervating the diaphragm very nicely. People who have spinal cord damage or nerve damage up in this area where their phrenic nerve is compromised, they will typically have to go on a ventilator, because without this nerve, the muscle doesn't contract. And even though the external intercostals might work, it's not enough. And they need to have assistance in breathing. All right. So let's pause for a second, take a look at what we know. For breathing to occur, the inspiratory center, the medulla oblongata, sends nerves impulses via the phrenic nerve to the diaphragm, the intercostal nerve to the external intercostal muscles. Those muscles contract, volume increases, we breathe in. Remember, volume increases, pressure decreases, air flows in. Why do the muscles relax? Well, the inspiratory center stops sending impulses. It alternates on, off, on, off. When it stops the impulses, the muscles relax and kind of even relax a little bit further, reducing the volume of the thoracic cavity even more, increasing the pressure, which is going to force air out via expiration. All right. Control of breathing summary. So let's look at the big picture now. We have, and this is again basic rhythmic breathing. The medulla oblongata is the center of the universe, right? It generates nerve impulses which travel down to via those nerves I mentioned to the muscles. But this automatic breathing is also influenced by the chemoreceptors and also the pons. I'm not going to talk about these two different regions, but just know that the pons can increase the activity of the medulla or decrease it. There is another component to breathing, which I haven't mentioned yet, and this is what we call the voluntary override for breathing. This is where other factors can affect breathing, whether we're in pain, whether we're emotional. As if anyone's experienced, you know, for example, when you're in a very severe emotional state due to maybe some trauma that you've experienced, that can also influence your breathing. All right. Now, what about deep breathing? Well, deep breathing is a whole other beast. In addition to the muscles I mentioned previously, the diaphragm and the external intercostals, you can imagine with deep breathing, we want to bring in even more air. So it makes sense, we want to even increase the volume of the thoracic cavity even more. So we have to recruit many muscles. Here you can see the scalenes, remember those? SCM, the pectoralis minor, which doesn't really show them here, but they are involved. The quadratus lumborum, and even the erector spinae on the back. It only shows some of those, but these are all involved in deep breathing, bringing air in. Now you might wonder, what the heck are these? These, in as much air as we brought in, when we were to exhale, we can't just exhale normally. We need to get rid of all that excess air. So with quiet breathing, remember, there were no, with exhaling or expiration, there were no extra muscles, right? It was just the diaphragm and the external intercostals just relaxed. In this case, with deep breathing, we've recruited the internal intercostals and the abdominal muscles, namely, if you think of like the obliques, the rectus abdominis, all those, they're going to contract, which is, think of like a bellow. It's going to help force air out. So it makes sense, right? We're exchanging a much larger volume of air, so we need to recruit extra muscles. So for deep breathing, in addition to the external intercostals and the diaphragm, we've also got these. And then for expiration, we've recruited abdominal muscles as well as the internal intercostals. And you can see right here, contraction of the internal and external obliques, the rectus abdominis, and underneath, we also have the transverse abdominis, which is the innermost layer. So all three layers of the abdominal muscles, rectus abdominis, the obliques, as well as the transverse abdominis, which is underneath, are all involved in forced expiration. All right, so unfortunately this picture came out a little bit small, but hopefully you can get kind of an idea of what's going on here. This is taking a look at the events, really primarily of quiet breathing. If you take a look kind of going from 1 to 5, inspiratory what it doesn't show, of course, the role of the medulla and the nerves, but of course you know that the medulla sends signals via the muscles. And we have the nerves, the intercostal nerve and the phrenic nerve go to the external intercostal muscles in the diaphragm, causing contraction of the diaphragm, contraction of the external intercostals, increasing the volume, ultimately decreasing the pressure, air flows in. During relaxation, the muscles actually relax. The thoracic cavity decreases in size, which increases pressure due to the decrease in lung volume. Ultimately, air flows out. And that is the story. All right, so it looks like someone put in a chat. Sir, I want to know, in case of a lung cancer and one of the lungs is removed, what happens to that space? Okay, let me just answer that. Great question. Oops. Okay. Well, I'll just say it verbally. It's easier than writing it down. So, for example, I had a relative that had lung cancer, and the inferior lobe, which on the right lung, was cancerous. So they actually had to go in and remove that lobe. The remaining two are there, but of course we have that space. What actually happens is the remaining two lobes enlarged to fill up that space. So I'm not sure at what capacity it can fill up. Say, for example, if someone had maybe a larger portion of their lungs. Let me just go back to that slide for a second, because that's an awesome question, actually. Oops, hold on. Let me just go to share screen. That's a really good question. So, here we go. Okay, why is that not working? Why? Let me go back 1 second. Share screen. Oh. Share. All right. All right. So hopefully the person that asked that is still here. So say, for example, this area is cancerous, this is removed. This space, which was previously occupied by this lobe, fills in. That's the beauty. There's kind of a compensation to enlarge. Now, say, for example, if the lung cancer was more widespread and doctors had to remove a much larger portion, I don't know if the remaining lobe can fill up that type of space, but I can tell you that there is the ability of compensation where what the space that was occupied by the now removed lung is filled up. So hopefully that answers the question that you had. All right. All right. Before I go to the review, any questions about this lecture? God, people didn't want to get up early. There's like 7 people.
And hi, sir.
Yes.
I want to know, like, in some cases of some people, like, they have a problem with their breathing, and there's actually a hole in their throat where, like, they put an extra breathing tube. So I want to know, like, because, like, when air goes through the nose, the air is being, like, filtered in the nose. But now, in case where there's no one nose, you breathe on your neck. So how is one protected?
Okay. So the sound was kind of going in and out of my computer. So I thought you said something about the nose.
Yeah.
If something's wrong with the nose, how do they filter air? Was that the question, or?
Yes, the question is, like, there's a problem with, I don't know, with breathing, and some patients I see, like, an extra tube on their neck. They breathe instead through their nose, they breathe with their neck. So I want to know, like, because, like, in the nose we have some mucus that filters air, but in the neck now, when the air goes through the neck into the lungs, we don't have all that mechanism that purifies air.
Oh, that's a really good question. So in short, I don't know. That's a really good clinical question. So this tube that's in the neck, is it going? Are the tubes coming from a machine, or or are they coming from like an oxygen machine? Do you know, or were
No,
there?
no, actually, like, I saw someone, like, he was a heavy smoker. So after some time, he went to the hospital and he came back. He could all I could see was just a tube on his neck without no machine attached to it, but I could hear, like, breathing out through the tube. So I
Oh,
didn't.
oh, I know what you mean. It's like a tracheotomy, like a hole, like right around
Yes,
here.
yes, sir.
Okay, so that's a really good question. So because certainly it's kind of bypassing the normal movement of air in through the nose and other areas, but from here down, you still have a large proportion of mucus in the trachea and the bronchi and the bronchioles that still have a lot of mucus. They still have a lot of cilia on their epithelium. So there still is enough area that you can effectively filter the air, even if you're not breathing in this way, if you're breathing through that. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great
Thank
question.
you.
Anyone else have a question before we go on to the review? All right. Okay. So let me just go to the review once again here. Here is, and obviously it's a very brief review because it's just the respiratory system, but I kind of like the fact that we're kind of keeping things brief, because I think brief and more focused, because I think it allows you to absorb the material even better. That's my hope. All right. So the exam, of course, as you know, is on the respiratory system. And let's take a look here. I'm looking for something. Oh, no, I'm good. All right. So when we're talking about the respiratory system, we first started talking about the functions, right? So you should know the functions of the respiratory system. Of course, certainly, for example, we know that it's important for bringing air into the body, exchanging it with the blood. But of course, you can add into that, as Ngo just mentioned, filtering the air, right? We don't want to exchange air with the blood if it's not clean. All right. So to accomplish everything that we need, of course, with all those different functions, we have several different organs. So you need to know the different organs of the respiratory system. Now, I mentioned it starts off with the nose. We didn't really talk about nasal anatomy, but you should know that it is part of the respiratory system, as is the larynx and the pharynx and the larynx. So know those and name all the different organs, but of course, structurally is really where we started getting into the trachea. All right, so if you're taking a look, starting with the trachea, we need to know all the organs and functions of the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. So remember, the conducting zone starts from the beginning, it goes all the way through the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, at least through the terminal bronchioles. That's the conducting zone. And then the respiratory bronchioles and the alveoli are part of the respiratory zone. So, and you should know the structure function correlation. What is it about the conducting zone that enables it to do its job? And of course, amongst other things, we've learned that there's ciliated epithelium, there's mucus, there's also cartilage that helps to keep the airways open, right? Without the cartilage, the airways would collapse every time we would exhale. So know the different organs and their functions and the changes between the trachea, the bronchi, stuff like that. I kind of repeated myself in this down here. So we spoke about the histology of the trachea. When I mean histology, know that it has the pseudostratified epithelium, right? Mucus cells, the type of cartilage, and also the changes that occur down through the bronchial tree. What are the changes that occur in the bronchi? What are the changes that occur in the bronchioles? What increases? What decreases? This takes us all the way down to the alveoli. And the alveoli, of course, that's the terminal end of the respiratory tract. Hold on one second. And that's, of course, ultimately where gas exchange occurs, as I mentioned, even with the respiratory bronchioles. But with the alveoli, it was very unique because we spoke about the cell types there and what their roles are. So this is not just the site for just gas exchange, but we've got two other cells that kind of help out, right? The type 2 cells, so you should know what those cells are doing, as well as the macrophages, what they're doing. For gas exchange to occur, we have to have what's known as the respiratory membrane. And this is very, very similar if we're looking at when we're looking at blood going between the capillaries and the tissues. Remember, the capillaries have a very simple squamous epithelium, so very short diffusion distance, very short and rapid. With the respiratory membrane, remember that the components are the capillary endothelium, or the tunica intima, the basal lamina, of course, and then that very thin, simple squamous type 1 alveolar cell. If someone has a lung condition, whether you're looking at emphysema or even pulmonary fibrosis, that respiratory membrane is disrupted and it can become scarred and thickened, which makes it harder to breathe. All right. All right. So once we got through a lot of the main structures for breathing, the conducting and the respiratory zone, then we took a look at this big old structure, the lungs, which is where the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli are really housed. So again, like we mentioned today, a lot of this came from today. where are the lungs located? What is their anatomy? What is the hilus, right? What is the root? What are the different lobes? What are the different fissures? Characteristics of each of the different lungs. The lungs are surrounded by pleural membranes. Remember, these are some more of those serous membranes that we spoke about with the heart. So again, just know the anatomy, the features of them. Blood vessels of the pulmonary circuit. This is kind of redundant, but obviously it's important to hear again. The arteries and veins of the pulmonary circuit, what type of blood they take. Is it oxygen rich? Is it oxygen poor? What side of the heart are they coming from? What side of the heart are they going to? What chamber? So it's kind of stuff that you heard before. Don't, in the cardiovascular system, don't just forget it, right? Just kind of hold on to it for a bit longer. We'll get through breathing. Hopefully you'll remember it for a long time. I'd mentioned that the autonomic nervous system, one of the targets for that is the respiratory system. And of course, you should know really the primary effect is on the bronchioles. You should know what the two different branches do. Why is that? There we go. Then we get into really what I would refer to as kind of the more physiological part of this topic, and taking a look at the mechanisms. We breathe really involuntarily, right? We don't think about it, but it's important to know what causes it, why we do breathe, why we bring air in. So we talked about several different aspects. We did speak about the pressure-volume relationship, how that really determines whether we're breathing in or breathing out, and why there's a change in volume, why there's a change in pressure. Then we kind of backed up and took a look at the beginning, where the respiratory centers are. In other words, if you think of the respiratory center, this is kind of really the center of the breathing universe. This is the master conductor. This is where the nerve impulses start, and of course, you know, that's in the medulla, and they generate impulses that go by way of those nerves. We did speak about the nerves with the quiet breathing. We didn't talk about the forced breathing, but you should know those quiet nerves involved in quiet breathing, what they innervate, what muscles they go to, what happens to those muscles. You should also know, of course, the muscles involved in deep or forced breathing. All right. Now, not any less important are the functions of the rest of the chemoreceptors, even though they're not the primary cause of our breathing, right? That's the medulla. These influence how fast or how slow, which is dictated by how much, primarily, even though I mentioned it's oxygen, CO2, and pH conditions in the body that dictate how fast or how slow. I do want to just mention that the principal factor is the CO2 and the pH. Changes in oxygen really at sea level where we're at don't really modify our breathing. You have to go up to a really high altitude. If you go up to Mount Whitney, some of the higher mountain peaks where oxygen is very low, that can influence breathing. But primarily at sea level, the chemoreceptors primarily respond to levels of CO2 and pH, know where they're located, know how they communicate. Well, at least with the peripheral chemoreceptors, we know, of course, that there's where they're located and what nerves convey their what they've just reported to the brain. And of course, the central chemoreceptor is already located in the brain. All right, so that takes us to the end of the review. Any questions? Oh, I just saw it go. You were the one that asked this other question too. Yeah, thanks for your questions. There's really good. All right, no questions?
No.
All right. Oh, hi,
No?
Joseph.
All right.
Yes. No questions?
No question.
Okay, thanks for piping in since I
Yeah.
don't know if someone had to. All right, you guys. Well, today is Wednesday, so I gave you kind of instructions for the lab. I did send you a couple pictures, an interesting addition, and it's not required for the class, but if you have the opportunity to get the app, the Visible Body Atlas, it's pretty amazing. You can actually look at different structures. You can subtract other structures out so you can see it better. If you have the opportunity to get it either on your iPad or on your smartphone or whatever, it's pretty good. But obviously you don't need it, but just thought I would throw it out there. Lab stuff, you've got a couple weeks to work on that. And then starting on Monday, I'm gonna be updating the lectures before that, but we're gonna start on the digestive system. So we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, I guess. We got the digestive system starting on May 6th. We've got, of course, got the exam on the 4th. Just one thing to mention about the exam. You will have, in the past, you guys have had a couple chances to go back and take a look at your question. You guys are doing well. I'm sort of like upping it a little bit. You guys are rising to the challenge. You still will have enough time, but instead of a couple opportunities, you'll have one. Same number of questions. And I think that's it. So if there's no other questions, I will see you guys on Monday.
Thank you.